Have you ever wondered what would happen if Luffy was reborn with all of his memories and powers? Would he manage to defeat his enemies early this time around, or would he accidentally change everything for the worse? So, the story begins the same way it did in the main timeline. Luffy is born, and eventually Garp drops him off at Fuchsia Village. Over time, with knowledge of how the first few years of his life will play out, Luffy will decide to keep his future memories to himself until Shanks arrives. However, as soon as Shanks gets on the island, we'll see the first big difference in this timeline. For starters, Luffy will beat up the mountain bandit on his own, this time using Haki, but what's even more interesting is that due to this, Shanks won't lose an arm. After Luffy eats his devil fruit, he'll reveal everything to Shanks' crew. At first, Shanks wouldn't believe Luffy's story about knowing the future. However, with his knowledge of how his devil fruit works, Luffy would instantly surprise Shanks with his ability to transform into his Nika form. This transformation would be proof enough for Shanks to take Luffy for his word. Shanks will then leave Luffy behind, promising to meet again. But before that, Luffy will ask Shanks for his hat, explaining how it was his most prized possession and was symbolic of their promise to meet again. Shanks will gladly oblige, seeing something special inside the boy. In the time that follows, Luffy will pretend that he's just a regular kid in front of Garp, Dadan, Ace, and Sabo. He'll do this in order to enjoy his limited time with them again, and also to prevent changing anything significant in the story. Eventually, he'll single-handedly defeat the Blue Jam Pirates without letting Ace or Sabo get involved using his Haki. Sabo will still try to leave the Goa Kingdom during the Celestial Dragon's visit, and surprisingly enough, I believe Luffy would let him do it. He already knows Sabo will survive and get rescued by Dragon, and he'll get the chance to help thousands of people as a Revolutionary Army member. Several years later, Ace will ask Luffy to join him on his journey, since this version of Luffy is a lot stronger and more capable than his main story self. But Luffy will refuse so that he can meet his crew again and let Ace experience his own adventure. Luffy will then train on his own now in secret in order to master his advanced Conqueror's, Armament, and Observation Haki skills. At 17 years old, Luffy will finally leave Fuchsia Island behind. He'd do it in the exact same way as before, hiding in a barrel in order to make sure he meets his crew again. After the Alvida pirates find him, Luffy will help free Kobe and take him to Shellstown. At Shellstown, he'll retrieve Zoro's swords for him in exchange for the swordsman joining his crew. Afterward, Luffy will tell Zoro that they need to go to Orangetown next to get their navigator. Although he wouldn't understand what Luffy means by this, he would follow along. Once they get there, the duo will free Nami from the buggy pirates after talking to the inhabitants of Orangetown. Seeing Luffy's overwhelming strength, the buggy pirates would immediately surrender this time around and would leave the island. Realizing just how overpowered Luffy really is, I believe that in this version of the story, Nami would be honest with him and tell him about Arlong and her village. Luffy, already knowing all about this, would obviously agree to help her. However, he would ask her to wait just a little bit longer since they need to go to the Syrup Village first in order to get their ship. He tried to explain to Zoro and Nami how there's a boy named Usopp there who's waiting for them, but none of them would understand what he's saying. Anyway, at Syrup Village, Luffy will meet Usopp, but instead of immediately defeating all the Black Cat pirates, Luffy will try to encourage Usopp to do it himself in order to boost his confidence. So in this version of the story, it's likely that Usopp will face off against the Black Cat pirates much earlier than before and might even defeat some of them. However, Kuro would soon arrive and attack Usopp with his Shakushi technique. After Usopp bravely tanks a hit from Kuro, Luffy will choose to finally end the fight by knocking his opponents out with a sharp burst of Haki. Satisfied with Usopp's new resolve, Luffy will ask his future sniper to join the crew. Indebted to the Straw Hat crew, Kaya will offer the crew a ship, same as in the original story. Seeing his old ship again, tears will start going down Luffy's face and he'll be so happy at the chance of sailing on it again. However, this time, he'll promise to keep it safe. Other Straw Hats would watch this and be completely confused as to why Luffy is so emotional about this ordinary ship. Now, with the ship and a new crewmate on board, Luffy will beg Nami for just one more small detour before they go save her village from the fishmen, the Baratier. And this is where Luffy will encounter the first major problem on his journey. Once they arrive, Luffy would spend a few days trying to convince Sanji to leave Zeph behind and join the crew as the new cook. However, Sanji will flat out deny Luffy every time. Nami will eventually get frustrated with the delays and will wind up sailing off on her own, leaving the crew behind. With Don Krieg's arrival, the Baratier's cooks will be threatened and that will prompt Luffy to stand up for old man Zeph in his dream. Evading literally every attack and easily punching through Don Krieg's armor with his Haki, Luffy will take out the Krieg pirates well before Mihawk's arrival. And although this seems good, it might not have been the smartest move, because Mihawk will now sense Luffy's Haki and would soon arrive to see what's going on. Seeing Mihawk approach, Zoro will immediately draw his swords and challenge him to a duel. Luffy will try to talk Zoro out of it, but in the end he'll let things play out in order to not be in the way of his crewmate's dream. Mihawk would initially be confused as to why someone as strong as Luffy is still in the East Blue and would maybe even attempt to fight him instead. However, in the end he'll give Zoro a chance to swing at him after seeing his resolve. Once he's defeated, Zoro will swear to Luffy that he won't disappoint his captain ever again. Mihawk will then have a chat with Luffy, noticing the very familiar straw hat he's wearing. In typical Luffy fashion, he'll tell Mihawk to watch out for Zoro since he's going to eventually achieve his dream of becoming the world's strongest swordsman. Mihawk will gladly accept Zoro as his future challenger, sensing that there is some truth behind Luffy's words. Seeing Zoro's resolve will be enough to inspire Sanji to leave Baratie behind and pursue his dream of finding the All Blue as well. The crew would then land in Kokoyashi Village, and Luffy would instantly make his way towards Arlong Park. Instead of using Conqueror's Haki to end the fight quickly, Luffy will make it a point to take down each fishman with his own hands. After taking Arlong down, Luffy will try to explain to him that what he is doing is wrong and that he should be more like Jinbei. Confused and angered by Luffy's mention of Jinbei, Arlong will try to kill him one more time but would get absolutely humiliated. With this, Luffy will proceed to destroy the entire Arlong Park while the crew gets the details of Nami's backstory from the townsfolk. Afterward, Nami and the rest of her village will celebrate Luffy's victory, but their celebrations will end early once Nemu decides to arrest the Straw Hats. With Nami being a former member of the Arlong Pirates, she'd also be targeted, and she'd realize that her best course of action would be to join the Straw Hats in order to keep the villagers safe. The crew's next destination? Loketown. In this version of the story, Zoro will fully recover by the time they reach Loketown since he never got the chance to face off against any fishmen. Not only that, but because of how overwhelmingly strong Luffy was, the Buggy and Alvida pirates won't attempt to get revenge. Considering Luffy used Conqueror's Haki a lot so far to deal with opponents, it's likely that some of the Marines saw him do it. This is why I believe that in this version of the story, Luffy's first bounty will end up being much higher, probably over 200 million berries. And although Luffy would be happy to see his bounty this high, with bigger bounty comes more attention, which isn't really a good thing. For example, Captain Smoker would likely call for even more reinforcements to come to Loketown in order to arrest Luffy. Once the crew arrives there, everything will go similarly to the original, with the crew shopping and Luffy visiting the legendary bar Goldie Roger visited. Eventually, Smoker will notice Luffy and start chasing him all over town, but even with all additional reinforcements, Luffy would easily escape while making sure not to hurt the captain in any way. Dragon would observe Luffy from the shadows and wouldn't step in to save him this time around. However, he would be visibly proud of Luffy after seeing how strong he's become. With all their new gear on board, the crew will swiftly make their way towards the Grand Line. However, this time around, instead of going through Reverse Mountain and risking any damage to the Going Merry, Luffy will decide to go through the Calm Belt. The crew, especially Usopp, would greatly oppose this decision, scared of the sea beasts attacking the ship, but Luffy would convince him that everything will be fine. Using his Conquerors and Observation Haki, Luffy will safely navigate the ship through the Calm Belt with the sea beasts staying out of his way. The crew will then visit Crocus and Laboon since Luffy would want to stop the whale from constantly hurting itself. After calming Laboon, the crew would come across Vivi and Mr. Nine. Luffy being Luffy will immediately call Vivi by her name, revealing to everyone that she's a princess. He'd try explaining to her how he knows her and that they've already met, but she'd think he's crazy. Thinking that Luffy knows too much, Vivi might even assume that he works for Crocodile. But after taking another look at him, she'd realize that he is most likely just crazy. The crew will then arrive on Whiskey Peak, and this arc will be much shorter than in the original story. First, Luffy will instantly notice Igaram amongst the bandits and would blow his cover as well. The rest of the bandits would then immediately attack the crew, but Luffy would swiftly deal with them using Haki. Mr. Five and Miss Valentine would also quickly get overwhelmed by the crew and defeated. Finally understanding that Luffy isn't the bad guy, Vivi would ask for his help in saving her kingdom. On the way there, Robin will infiltrate Luffy's ship, same as in the original, but after seeing his resolve and general kindness towards her, she'll find him amusing and would let them continue. The crew will then arrive at Little Garden, and everything in this arc will play out pretty much the same. They'd make the peace between giants and easily defeat Mr. 3. One major change in this version would be Luffy handling the giant goldfish himself. The giants wouldn't even warn him since they'd realize his strength. As in the original, Nami will fall sick after leaving Little Garden. Luffy will then ask for Chopper, but he'll only get weird looks from the rest of his crew. That's when he'll remember that it's time they visit Drum Island. Before reaching the island, Luffy will absolutely annihilate Walpole and send him flying away. He'll then take Nami to the castle where Dr. Kurahai is by jumping up using Boundman instead of climbing the mountain himself. This would be the first time Luffy's ever used one of his gears in front of his crewmates. Since Nami would be half conscious during this trip, she'd probably think it's just a hallucination. Not finding anyone in the castle, Luffy will wait till Chopper arrives and would instantly hug the reindeer, which would definitely freak him out. After Nami recovers, Luffy will beg Chopper to join his crew and will eventually get his way after Dr. Kuroha encourages him to follow his dreams. Now with a doctor on board, the crew will finally set sail for Alabasta. After reaching the shore, Luffy will tell the crew to wait for him on the ship while he goes to Alaburna with Vivi. There he'll drop Vivi off with Cobra and will ask her to let him ride Karoo to Rain Base. At Rain Base, Luffy will enter Crocodile's casino on his own, and after almost falling for the same stupid trap again, he'll use his future sight to avoid it. He'll then confront Crocodile right there and then, and would easily defeat the Warlord, stopping the Civil War from ever happening. There, he'll also ask Robin to join his crew after explaining how he's been reborn and how they're supposed to be friends. He'll convince her to join by explaining how she was a valuable member of his crew that he'll protect from the world government at all costs. By the end of the arc, instead of celebrating, Luffy will meet Ace and spend some time with him before leaving. Soon after departing, a ship will fall from the sky, and Luffy wouldn't be surprised at all by it. Instead, he'll confidently tell the crew that they're going to the sky next. However, before that, the crew would arrive in Jaya. So how would a meeting between Luffy and Blackbeard go this time around? Well, I'm gonna have to immediately disappoint you. You see, due to Luffy and the crew finishing everything much earlier in Alabasta, they'd arrive on Jaya much earlier than Blackbeard and won't even have a chance to meet. Instead, Luffy would instantly find and put down Bellamy before he started creating problems. He'll also tell Bellamy that he's going to take down his boss Doflamingo. After that, Luffy will visit and reassure Mont Blanc about Sky Island's existence and will tell him about the City of Gold. Then he'll ask him to loan them a ship for the journey so that they could avoid any damage to Going Merry. Upon entering Skypiea, Luffy will immediately sense Enel's haki and will dart towards him. After going through all of Enel's forces by himself, he'll punch Enel down and bring his reign of terror to an end. The 400-year Sky Wars will officially end once Luffy rings the Golden Bell. With all that over, Luffy will then party with the Shandians and they'll show his crew the Poneglyph. The crew will then float back to the mainland and swap their ship for the Going Merry again. Once the crew reaches Long Ring Longland, Luffy wouldn't really bother with Foxy and his stupid games. However, there's a much bigger problem in this arc than Foxy, and it's that Admiral Aokiji would soon arrive on the island. So how would this interaction go? Well, Luffy will be well equipped to handle the Admiral this time, and the two will engage in a battle. After exchanging a few punches, Luffy would finally transform into Gear 5th for the first time in this version of the story. Sensing Luffy's strength, Aokiji would then back off, because, let's be honest, he's just too lazy to fight Luffy all out, especially without a good reason. He wouldn't even bother warning Luffy about Robin since he knows she's affiliated with someone strong enough to protect her. With Mary still in perfect condition, once the crew arrives at Water 7, they won't be looking for a new ship this time around. Robin won't end up being blackmailed into helping CP9 either, since she can rely on Luffy's strength. As soon as they arrive on the island, Luffy will inform Iceberg of the CP9 agents in Galila, and he'll confront them in front of everyone. The agents will gang up on Luffy but will fall one by one. Since Luffy saved Iceberg's life, he'd go on to offer to upgrade their ship for free and make it ready for the New World. And although everything seems to be going great in this arc so far, there's one huge problem. Where's Frankie? You see, considering the crew never went to Enies Lobby in this version of the story, it also means that they never bonded with Frankie. I'm sure Luffy would do his best to track Frankie down and convince him to join, but let's be real. Would Frankie really join a random pirate crew he's never met and leave his family behind? I don't think so. This is why in this version, despite Luffy's best efforts, Frankie won't be joining the crew. Luffy would blame himself for this and would vow to stay on Water 7 until Frankie changes his mind, but with Garp arriving on the island, Luffy would be forced to leave in order to protect his crew from the Marines. Thankfully though, the next member of the crew would be much easier to recruit, because as soon as the crew nears the Florian Triangle, they'll find Brook and Luffy will immediately ask him to join. After docking at Thriller Bark, the story would go similarly to canon, with the crew slowly progressing through the island and defeating Maria's officers. The only difference here is that Luffy would be ready to fight and defeat Oars himself instead of leaving him for his crew. You might have noticed that in this version of the story, Luffy participated in way more fights than in the original, which made the journey for his crew much easier this time around. But what if I tell you that this isn't actually a good thing, and will have some serious consequences in the future? You see, these actions will severely hinder the crew's progression, as they didn't really have to struggle at any point so far. Since they didn't fight Oars together, their teamwork would also be much worse, which would lead to some terrible things happening in the future. Anyways, with one swift, hard, and hockey punch, Luffy will knock Maria out and give everyone their shadows back. The crew will then party and leave Thriller Bark before Kuma even arrives. At Salbadi, events will unfold mostly the same until Luffy punches St. Carlos and meets Rayleigh. This time around, Rayleigh would be impressed with Luffy's hockey and would realize that it's the same boy Shanks told him about. Luffy will then tell Rayleigh of his rebirth, something Rayleigh will believe immediately, unlike several other characters so far. With their ship coated and ready to go, the crew will board it while Luffy and Rayleigh fight off the pacifistas, Kuma, Sentamaru, and Kizaru. Kuma would be shocked seeing Luffy transform into Gear 5th in order to fight Kizaru, and would immediately realize Luffy is the sun god he heard about in the stories. From here on, some big changes will take place. Firstly, considering Kuma didn't teleport the Straw Hats this time around, they'd continue their journey as usual. However, knowing that they'll soon be entering the new world, Luffy would have to make a big decision. He'd inform his crew that before they continued, they'd have to take a big break and train to prepare for the enemies ahead. The crew would then make their way to Rusakaina, the island where Rayleigh trained Luffy, in the main story. The entire crew would start their hockey training there, and it's likely that Rayleigh would help train them. After some time, the news of Ace's capture would reach Luffy, and he would leave his crew with Rayleigh for a bit in order to go and save him. The only one he'd take with him is Nami, because, well, he can't pilot a ship on his own. This time around, Luffy would arrive at Impel Down a few days earlier, meaning Ace would still be in prison. Now in the original story, Boa helped Luffy sneak into the prison, and considering she isn't there this time, he'll have to improvise. The only real threat in the prison for Luffy would be Magellan due to his incredibly powerful Devil Fruit, and although his poison is pretty much unstoppable, I believe that Gear 5 Luffy would find some way around it, either by turning the poison into rubber or simply dodging it. Anyway, as soon as he deals with Magellan, there will be no one to stop Luffy from advancing deeper into the prison, and he'll soon arrive to Ace's cell. Once Ace sees Luffy, he'll break into tears and couldn't believe that his brother came to save him. Luffy would then free both Ace and Jinbei, and on his way back, he'd also free Ivankov and the rest of Okama from level 5.5. Together, they'd all make their way back to Luffy's crew. As for Crocodile, Buggy, and Mr. 3, well, they would stay in prison. Due to Ace being rescued early in this version of the story, the Marineford War will never take place. Whitebeard pirates will remain the Emperor crew, and Blackbeard won't eat the second Devil Fruit. Although Luffy would ask Ace to join his crew after the rescue, Ace would likely refuse and soon return to Whitebeard. After 2 full years of training, the crew would significantly level up their skills and eventually continue their journey. At Salbadi, they'll get their ship coated once again and will head down to Fishman Island. Since Fishman Island is still Whitebeard's territory in this version, they wouldn't face any trouble with people there. Immediately after arriving, Luffy will go to the palace to talk to the king. King Neptune won't trust him at first and won't even let him see the princess. Soon after, Vanderdecken will once again try to launch the Ark Noah at Fishman Island, and Luffy will wind up destroying it. If you're wondering why Hody Jones hasn't popped up in this arc quite yet, it's because while under Whitebeard's rule, I believe that the new Fishman pirates won't have the guts to coordinate an attack. However, just to be sure, Luffy could tip off King Neptune or Jinbei about Hody, which should be enough to foil his plans. With that done, the same day, the crew will arrive at Punk Hazard. There, they'll meet Kinemon and Law facing off outside Caesar's facility. Luffy will put an end to the battle and will ask to form an alliance with the Heart Pirates. He'll also promise Kinemon that they'll save Wano soon, which would leave the samurai confused since he didn't even ask for any help. Caesar's forces would be swiftly defeated afterward, and the crew, along with Law and Kinemon, would continue their journey. With Luffy being as strong as he is, and even more notorious now, Doflamingo won't bother with tricking the Straw Hats this time. Also, since Ace didn't die in this version, there wouldn't be a Coliseum tournament for Mera Mera no Mi, and the Straw Hats would never meet any of these characters. Immediately upon arrival, Luffy will charge towards Doflamingo's castle. In the meantime, the rest of the crew will deal with his officers and might even free the Tontada while they're at it. Sensing that Luffy is worthy, Doflamingo won't waste any time trying to delay the fight. With his fruit awakened, he'll put up a decent fight before Luffy taps into Gear 5 and absolutely destroys him. Meanwhile, Law and the rest of the Straw Hats will destroy the weapons factory and save Kanjuro. The Straw Hats will simply leave the island after Doflamingo's defeat, while Kiros assumes his place on the throne. Fujitoro would try to stop them, but Luffy would easily hold him off. Now at this point of the story, instead of splitting up, the Straw Hats will visit Zou together. There, they'll find Raizo and intercept Jack's attack before the Beast Pirates arrive. Luffy will then send Jack flying off Zou and into the sea. Earning Nekomamushi and Inorashi's trust, the Straw Hats will get shown the poneglyph. While they're there, Sanji will receive a letter from Big Mom informing him about the wedding. Considering Luffy's strength at this point, they can just ignore the letter, right? Well, not really. You see, the real reason Sanji went to Whole Cake wasn't because he was scared of Big Mom, it was because she threatened to kill Zeph. This is why I believe Sanji would still agree to come to Whole Cake even in this scenario. So once again, Luffy and the crew would follow after, but this time Luffy would make it his goal to beat her up for threatening Zeph. Having nothing to do with this plan, Law will instead focus his efforts on getting intel in Wano with his crew and the rest of the Scabbards. Entering Toto Land, the story will more or less go the same way up until Luffy fights Cracker and defeats him in minutes rather than days. At this point, an enraged Big Mom would send her entire crew after them, but this time, Luffy would know how dangerous fighting all these characters at the same time is and would order his crew to retreat for a bit. They would get back on the ship and go straight to Whole Cake Island to deal with Big Mom personally. Once there, Luffy will fight Big Mom alone as none of his crewmates are ready to battle against an Emperor of the Sea. So, could he win? Of course. I mean, judging by everything we saw, Big Mom should be weaker than Kaido to some extent. And considering Luffy beat up Kaido relatively easily with Gear 5, it should pose no problem. The crew would then retreat from the island, with Pedro still alive in this version. With Big Mom's clear defeat, shockwaves will travel across the One Piece world. I believe Luffy would be named the Emperor of the Sea earlier than in the main story, replacing Big Mom. Garp will hear about Luffy's work on Fishman Island while escorting King Neptune and Shirahoshi to the Holy Land. Luffy will also become the most discussed topic at the Reverie this time. Not only that, Ace will hear about Luffy and will be extremely proud of his brother. With so much happening, Fujitora's plan to absolve the Shichibukai system won't even be considered this year, meaning that warlords would continue to exist. Due to this, the Cross Guild would never get created, but an even more interesting thing is that Kobe wouldn't get abducted by Blackbeard. You see, the only reason Kobe got caught is because he went to Amazon Lily to deal with Boa, which wouldn't happen this time around. This also means Garp wouldn't have to rescue him and would stay safe in Marineford. Back to the Straw Hats, with Kaido unaware of Luffy's arrival, the Straw Hats will reach Wano's shores with virtually no resistance. They'll reconvene with the other Scabbards and Law much faster, but knowing Luffy, he'll jump at the first sight of Kaido over the Flower Capital. Luffy will fight Kaido right above the city, and will use his Gear 5 powers right from the get-go. Now, although this sounds like a good thing, there are some important things we need to consider. Firstly, when Luffy transformed into Gear 5 in the original story, Kaido was already somewhat tired since he fought against many different opponents before that. This time around, he'd be at his full strength when Luffy transforms, which would lead to a much more exciting fight. Don't get me wrong, I still believe Luffy would pull off a win here. It might just take more time than he expected. But that's not even the biggest problem. While Luffy fights Kaido, All-Stars and Tobi-Roppo are bound to appear at some point, which means Law and the other Straw Hats would have to keep them at bay. I believe the Straw Hats would split up the same as in the original story, with Zoro fighting King, Sanji fighting Queen, Robin fighting Black Maria, and so on. But the real question is, can the Straw Hats win these duels this time around? Due to knowing exactly what was about to happen at each point in the story, Luffy often took all responsibilities into his own hands and fought all hard fights on his own. Over time, this led to the Straw Hats being significantly weaker in this version of the story. Yeah, sure, they did train with Luffy and Rayleigh this time around, but without all those near-death experiences, there's just no way that they'd be able to develop the same skills. One by one, the Straw Hats will begin to fall. Zoro would go down first, as King would be vastly superior to him in this version. Once Luffy sees this, he'd be terrified and would immediately rush to help Zoro, which would leave him fully open to Kaido's attacks. With this, the other Straw Hats would start panicking and their defenses would slowly crumble. Soon after, every single Straw Hat would get defeated, and their journey would come to an abrupt end.